him? Shouldn't there be a bit more like belief than you actually believe it?
No, but that's, look, I know them all. I can absolutely state that I couldn't imagine myself voting for Diane Abbott. I don't think that if her politics had ever held sway in the Labour Party, we'd have had one day in government, let alone 13 years. I look at the Andy Burnham, Ed Balls, Ed Miliband, David Miliband. I think they're very, very good people. I think they've got the right values and so forth. But you have to make a judgment, and I'm in a position that I suppose is quite privileged. I know them all very, very well. So my own judgment is that of the four, based on what I know and what I see in them and the experience that they've had, that David is the most likely to be able to take the Labour Party. I think Max is absolutely right. We do have to start thinking about the future. This Lib Dem Conservative coalition, it's motoring a bit. And I think...
Before we move on too quickly, though, you did question Max saying that this war in Iraq was fought on false pretences. Yeah. Can I question that statement? Because quite clearly it was fought on false pretences. There were no weapons of mass destruction. It may not be to your credit now, but that is a fact.
I'm not saying that's not a fact. I'm not saying that when the invasion took place...
So you accept it was fought on false pretences?
No, because false pretenses suggest that we were...
Suggests that we were conned?
No, it suggests you were misled, and you weren't, because the...
We were misled?
No.
We were misled.
You were not misled. You were not misled.
We were told there were weapons of mass destruction by our government, by you.
Can I answer this, David?
Yes, or answer it briefly if you would, and I'll come to that. Yes, go on.
There's a whole... Tony Blair's the Prime Minister. He's sitting there. He's seen this intelligence, which has all been published. People can go and see why he made the decision that he did. And he's there in the context post-September the 11th, genuinely worried because of his record.
I'm not saying you deliberately lied.
Well, that is what false pretences says.
No, it's not. What it means is the premise of the war...
Max is, by the way. Max is. Duplicity is lying.
OK, I'm not calling you a liar. I'm just saying you were wrong. And actually, since at the time you fought very, very hard, we're at the BBC, to get the BBC to apologise, maybe you could apologise for just being wrong. Being wrong.
Because, we disagree.
You were wrong.
We're wrong about the weapons of mass destruction.
Well, that's the key part. That was what you fought the war on.
It was about disarming Saddam Hussein and forcing him to face up to his obligations under United Nations law.
That wasn't why you fought the war.
Going right the way back to the
war because you said to the British public he had weapons of mass destruction, and he didn't.
All right,
and that's just wrong.
You just, Alistair Campbell, you said you supported David Miliband for the leadership of the Labour Party. Do you agree with him when he says, but if we'd known then what we know now, if we'd have known Saddam did not have weapons of mass destruction, there would have been no UN resolutions, no vote in the House of Commons, no war. Do you agree with him on that?
It would have. Certainly, yeah, I do. I do. But I don't accept... What I think that both Piers and Max are trying to say, even if they say they're not, is that we were essentially trying to mislead the British public.
Is that what you're saying, Max?
I'm absolutely sure of it. I'm sure of anything. I will bet my socks that the Iraq War inquiry, whatever else it concludes, will conclude that Tony Blair gave private undertakings to George Bush about his willingness to support an American invasion of Iraq, and then produced, with your energetic assistance, a dossier which sexed up the intelligence in order to convince the British public.
You talk about that inquiry. There's been three inquiries into that already, and I've been cleared by every single one of them. And you can speculate as to what the Chilcot inquiry will say. I would prefer to let them continue to take their evidence, and then we'll see. But it's very, very easy for people to get on their high horses and say, well, if they'd have been there, they'd have made the right decision. Tony Blair was the guy, because John will know as having...
But it's very, very easy of you to sit here now. And as I say, I'm not accusing you of lying, or Tony Blair. I don't know whether you lied or not, but I've known you a long time, and I've always liked you, and you've never lied to me particularly.
Oh, well, yes, he has. He has.
Actually,
you accused him of lying.
He has lied to me, but never about anything as serious as this.
And you accused him of sacking you.
But I don't think it's...
all sorts of things.
I hope I did.
I think it's kind of irrelevant to the point that I'm trying to argue here, which is simply this. You were wrong. Whether you meant to be or not, you were wrong.
We were wrong about the intelligence about weapons of mass destruction on which this decision was partly based. It wasn't just about WMD. It was the whole history of Saddam. It was the fact that you were dealing with a brutal dictator.
But you only got the resolution for war because of WMD.
There have been resolutions going way back.
Has this created a lack of trust? Did this create the lack of trust with Labour that led to the election result that you got? Or do you think it wasn't a factor in people's minds? They didn't trust you particularly and Tony Blair?
I think it would be impossible to think there wasn't certainly political damage, but just remember, just a minute though, Matt, we won an election after the Iraq War under Tony Blair. and including after the Hutton inquiry, and including after all the difficult circumstances of that. So I think it's... And all I ask of people, all I say to people is I do understand how people reached a different opinion. Piers and I used to argue about this literally on a daily basis because he was then editor of the Daily Mirror, I was doing my job, I was trying to persuade him, I knew it was an impossible task. He was trying to persuade me we were making the biggest mistake of our lives. And he was doing it, I think, genuinely out of a belief that he sort of felt a strong duty to say that. And we were having those arguments. All I can say to you is I do understand how people reached a different opinion. But ultimately, please try to understand why Tony Blair reached a different opinion. And he ultimately is the guy who has to make that decision.
You understand, but don't apologise.
I'm not going to apologise because that would say I don't support what the government did, and I do support what the government did.
Susan Kramer.
Well, at least the Bush administration was honest that they went in for regime change and that the issue of weapons of mass destruction was merely a side issue.
And let's be thankful for regime change, by the way.
You know, I mean, I think all of us are reasonably convinced the British government went in on the coattails of Bush, quite frankly. Look, I come from the one party.
What about Ed Miliband and Ed Balls?
Well, let me say, I mean,
which was the question, Sarah Garaban. I'm sorry, we went rather far away from it with this other argument.
I come from the one party that stood against the war, that said at the time it was a false prospectus, that it was in violation of international law. And I remember what happened to Charles Kennedy, the chuntering from both the Conservative and the Labour benches, Chamberlain Charlie, Chamberlain Charlie. Yep. And it seems to me that if whether Miliband or Balls or whatever are going to suddenly disown that past, it has to come with a huge apology and with a real sort of mea culpa, because if they haven't learnt the lessons of how to deal with international challenge, and if they haven't learned the lessons of being honest and straight with the British people, and of also not having this sort of puppy-dog relationship with the United States, then frankly, I don't think they're fit to be leaders of the Labour Party or any party.
I actually spoke to Ed Balls at the time. He never mentioned any of this to me, and I talked to him about Iraq. So I'm absolutely flabbergasted.
What did he say to you?
Well, I'm not going to reveal the conversation.
Well, you've just revealed a non-conversation.
As everybody in politics knows, he was extremely close to Gordon Brown at the time, and to see now that he was so unequivocally opposed to the war, I am flabbergasted by.
Okay,
but I don't think 2 sentences let you move on like this.
Alistair Campbell, if his children had been killed in order to get rid of Saddam Hussein, would it have been worth it?
Well, my children, that's a, you know, fine, those who applaud can applaud me being asked to speculate about the death of my children. It's, if they were in the armed forces, if they were, which they're not...
What really struck me to ask this in this particular way, there was an Iraqi man, he came home and his whole family had been destroyed because the Americans had bombed the house because they thought Saddam Hussein was there, which he wasn't. Well, his whole family, his children just going through university and all the rest of it. And so the people who make decisions to go to war should really consider it in that light.
Of course they should. Of course they should, and I agree with that. The British forces who are there and the British forces who've died have acted so that families like that, yes, it's taken far too long, yes, there's still bloodshed and so forth, but actually the British forces who took part in that operation have made Iraqi families safer for the future. And I think Britain should be very, very proud about that. You asked me about my children. You asked me about my children. If my children were serving in the armed forces, which they're not, then would I have been happy for them to go? Yes, of course, but they're not, which is why, frankly, I think it's not a very sensible question.
All right, the man up there at the back.
Why is it that every government that comes in thinks that Britain rules the waves? Why can't they leave it to the UN to manage and police these areas?
OK, John Redwood, and perhaps you'd like to answer the question that we were...
Yeah, sure. Well, I think the obvious reason why